Bitcoin Beach. Here we are, Bitcoin Beach. This is what it looks like. I mean, this is the more rocky part of it. It smooths out over there, but you have lots of vendors. You have a little Bitcoin sign over there. Of course, you have the Pacific over here. Straight that way, a few thousand miles, is Antarctica, straight south. And then, of course, you have beautiful cliffs and all that everywhere. So, people, I'm sure, are going to ask me, what is Bitcoin Beach like? Is there lots of Bitcoin? Are people using it? Is it all just hype? Is it all just, you know, a bunch of publicity stunts and all that? And I think there's a mix of truth in all of that. You know, I think in the beach here in El Zonte, in Bitcoin Beach, anecdotally, I think there's like 80% or something of merchants that are using it. That doesn't mean, you know, necessarily most of their transactions are on Bitcoin, but I think at least 80% of the local businesses here, you know, probably at least 100 or so, at least accept Bitcoin. And again, that, you know, probably the vast majority of those transactions are in cash. Probably most of the Bitcoin transactions are when Bitcoiners like me show up and want to spend our sats. So, but it's been fun. It's been fun to spend lots of sats and have transactions. My hot wallets and lightning wallets are almost empty from spending them this week. Not that I spent that much, but you know, so that was fun to have lots of transactions and have it be normal and not have to explain it every time. Outside of El Zonte, outside of the beach here, it's definitely a different story. You know, it's nowhere near 80%. It's probably closer to 1%, if that. You know, and it's much less. And I think that's disappointing to a lot of people. You know, a lot of people here, I think, well, not here, but I think a lot of people online would be disappointed because they probably picture El Salvador as this big, you know, Bitcoin mecca, this big Bitcoin utopia. And that's just not the reality of it, you know. Probably 1% or less of, you know, stores out there are using it regularly. You know, Mike Peterson, who I was talking to, his house is just over there, actually. We were talking about that. We recorded a show, and he had the same experience. You know, obviously he lives here. I've only been here 6 days. He's been here for many years, and obviously is very involved with Bitcoin the last 2 years. And that's his guess too. It's about 1% of people using Bitcoin, saving a Bitcoin, or exchanging a Bitcoin in stores here. So really not that much, quote unquote. However, I always like to focus on the rate of change and not the change itself. I think that's far more important. The rate of change, I think, is far more important. Going from 0.00000% adoption to 1% is a really big deal. You know, even going from 1% of a percent to 1% is a really big deal, right? You know, so I think in the same way we saw with Bitcoin extreme percentage returns the first few years, 2011, 2012, 2013, I think we're seeing the same thing here, that going from 1,000th of a percent or 1,000,000th of a percent or 1% of a percent, going from a very small portion of a percentage point to now 1 percentage point, more or less, that's a massive spike up. In the same way of like Bitcoin going from 1 cent to $30 is a massive percentage spike up. Even though it's a very small nominal number, you know, $30 is like nothing for Bitcoin, right? Obviously now that it's about 37,000 US. I mean, you know, I think it's the same thing here. We've just seen a massive spike the last 2 years here, in the same way that we saw Bitcoin in 2010, in 2011, and 2012. I think we're seeing that here with 2021, 2022, 2023. And so I think from here, just guessing and you know, trying to think it through. I've been here 6 days, and so, you know, talking to lots of locals that either are into Bitcoin, aren't into Bitcoin. You know, obviously there's a bit of a language barrier, but, you know, trying to get a sense of that. And I think we're, you know, entering that stage where those kinds of explosive returns slow down. You know, obviously going from 1% of a percent to 1% is 100x in adoption, and obviously we're not going to 100% adoption in the next 2 years. That's just not feasible. That's not happening. So, you know, maybe things slow out. Maybe in a couple of years we're at 2%, then 3%, then 5%, then 8%. You know, maybe things slow out, you know, those quote-unquote diminishing returns. But I think my larger belief, well, I know my larger belief is that eventually those diminishing returns eventually break to the upside. You know, we have these massive returns going from 0.0001 adoption to 1% adoption, diminishing returns maybe from 1% to 10, 15, 20% or so, and then, you know, once that curve flattens out a little bit, as the dollar continues to fall, as just network effects, Metcalfe's law, Gresham's law, all these concepts begin to manifest overtly to people, then I think that's when we have that exponential upside beyond there. I think it'll be the same elsewhere in the world, but really the point I'm making this video, and the thing that's super exciting to me, is not the percentages, it's not how many people are using Bitcoin, but it's the amount of change that's occurred. You know, this is my first time to El Zonte, but talking to so many people, both locals and Bitcoiners, is just how much change has occurred in the last 2 years. Here in El Zonte, I hear three things. I've heard, number one, and again and again and again, wow, it's so safe, wow, the gangs are gone, wow, the violence is gone, wow, I can go outside and walk at night and I feel safe, I don't feel like I'm at threat, I'm at risk, right? The second thing that everyone talks about is the roads. Oh, the roads are so much better, the roads are better, because they've gone from dirt roads to now paved roads. And then third, which Mike Peterson talked about, is that also a big deal, but perhaps less overt than the lack of gangs or the presence of better roads, is the sewer system. Now, before they put in the roads, obviously they put in a new sewer system, spent millions of dollars on it here in the town, and that's been a really big impact on the community, apparently. And so for me, that's very exciting, that this little bit of adoption in this tiny little town has increased tourism, it's increased people's willingness and interest to invest here. I know multiple people, I know many people that are either buying real estate, looking to buy real estate, looking to build condos, houses, vacation homes, businesses, restaurants. I know a lot of people like that that are either already doing that and have been doing that for a couple of years now, or are just starting to do that, or just starting their construction, or just, I know a lot of people that are personally putting money, millions of dollars into El Zonte and the local surrounding area. And that is directly having this impact on the, people that live here, a couple thousand people that live here, for a better standard of living. And so obviously, this is one tiny little beach on the entire planet. Obviously, this is not going to scale to the whole planet overnight. In fact, it's probably going to take many decades. But I'm optimistic that if such a small Bitcoin adoption here, where the vast majority of locals here are not using Bitcoin as frequently as the crazy Bitcoiners with orange shirts and glasses like me are, just how much that can incentivize people to come back, people to move back. Someone I was talking to last night, they were going to Texas. They're local El Salvadoran here, late 20s, pretty young guys, and they're going to Texas because they're meeting up with 1,000 El Salvadorans that are currently living in the United States but want to move back here. And so they're going to this small group of well, not small, 1,000 people. They're going to this group of El Salvadorans and showing them the things that have changed, trying to explain, the case for why they could consider moving back, because they want to move back home, they want to come back to their families, but they just haven't been able to because of the gangs, because of the violence, and because of the lack of economic opportunities. But now, with hopefully that changing, hopefully more people can move back and can come back home to where they want to be this whole time. So that's really exciting to me. And then beyond the beach here, beyond the local, beautiful scenery here, over in the main city, San Salvador, capital, over there, things are very different too. I've not seen a single homeless person in my stay here. And actually, I've been traveling a lot, working a lot, quote unquote working. It is work. It's a lot of work, but I mean, in scenery like this, it doesn't feel like work. But yeah, actually, as a side note, I've been here 6 days. I haven't gotten out and surfed until this morning. I just finished an hour surfing lesson, which is why my hair is a little bit of a bird's nest right now. And now I'm leaving for the airport in like 30 minutes. So, so this morning was my play morning. But the other 6 days, it was constantly networking with people, going around places. Obviously, there was a Bitcoin conference that I spoke at. I talked with Max Kaiser and Stacy. I had my own presentation. I had a podcast with Mike Peterson right over there, and networking, with a lot of those builders, contractors, and people buying land here, traveling all around the coast here, seeing what people are doing and investing in, just learning out of curiosity and learning what's going on here. And so despite all that traveling, being to multiple cities, San Salvador for a few days, being here for a while, being at all these other cities, I'm not seeing a single homeless person. Obviously, the average home here is not nearly as luxurious and prosperous as the average home in America or in the West or Michigan. But I think there's something to be said there. In America, when I go to Boston or when I go to Miami or Los Angeles or Toronto, places in Canada, even places in Europe I've been to a lot of cities in the West, Indianapolis, Chicago, Detroit, all these cities, Columbus, across the Midwest, across the United States, across Canada, across Europe. So many of these cities have an overt homeless problems spilling over into the streets. They have overt drug problems spilling into the streets. They have a burden or heavy, weighty feeling of nihilism, essentially. And that's sad. I'm not mocking these people, but I don't feel that here. I was in Guatemala City back in February, about 10 months ago, 9-10 months ago, and even there, it was more or less a similar feeling. So I know that it's not a difference between the United States and here, because I felt the same thing in Guatemala, and people here in El Salvador tell me it's the same thing, that in Guatemala or Nicaragua or Honduras, other Latin American countries close to El Salvador here, that it's a very different feeling. That here, for the first time in the last 24 months or so, since 2020, 2021, people have hope, or they have optimism, or they have the belief that 2 years from today or 5 years from today, it's going to be a better future than it is in the present, right? And I think that's the fundamental, crucial difference. My friend Jeff Booth and I, we always talk about the complex emergent behaviors of society, and I think that's what we're seeing here. That as an increasing percentage of the population in El Salvador here have reasons to be optimistic, whether that's Bitcoin, whether that's the lack of the gangs, whether that's the presence of more tourists or more people moving back home, or at least less people leaving the country, whatever the reason is. And I'm not naive, I know Bitcoin and the total population is probably the smallest reasons of those I just listed. Of those, whatever the reason is, people have more and more optimism for that future. And I think that's why we're seeing so many, that's why I think I'm seeing so many El Salvadorans start their own businesses. Whoops, my feet just got soaked. I think that's why we're seeing so many El Salvadorans start businesses. I think that's why we're seeing almost a reverse immigration back from the United States to El Salvador. I think those 1,000 El Salvadorans in Texas that are considering moving back here, I think that's just a start. I think we're going to see more and more of that as these network effects grow, and as more and more people in El Salvador get that work ethic and get that drive again. No longer is the incentive simply to just leave the United States or join the gangs, as resources continue to become centralized more and more in the hands of a violent few, backing it by the power of a gun, whether that's with the government and political corruption, or that's with the gangs and violent street corruption. Whatever the case, that's less the incentive now. And finally, the economic monetary incentive is shifting away from monetary repression and towards increasing productivity again. And I think fundamentally that's why we're seeing so much more Bitcoin adoption here. I think that's why we're seeing more businesses here. I think that's why we're seeing more people move back. And I think fundamentally that's why the vibe feels so different here. Obviously within our little Bitcoin bubble of El Zante and Bitcoin Beach here, it's a little on hyperdrive. But again, even outside of here, even with only 1% Bitcoin adoption, I feel real change on the streets and the businesses and around in the cities here. And that's really encouraging to me. Is all that Bitcoin led? No, not necessarily. But I do think that when you have corrupt money, you corrupt the economic incentives. So when you corrupt the economic incentives, you corrupt the morals of society. And I think vice versa. When you corrupt the morals, you corrupt the incentives. As people's morals are perverse, the incentives become perverse, which then means that the money becomes even more perverse. And so I don't attribute all of this benefit and beauty here happening in El Salvador to Bitcoin, but I do think Bitcoin is a key component of that feedback loop. As a society here gets a longer time preference, as they become more optimistic on the future, I think their minds will shift. They'll have a longer time preference. They'll prioritize not just surviving for the day, but saving for the future. I think that perspective shift accelerates Bitcoin adoption here, and then vice versa. I think the more that businesses accept Bitcoin, the more that Bitcoin's talked about, the more that Bitcoin's used, the less fees they have to pay for remittances and to credit card fees and all that, the more they're able to save, the more they're able to prosper, the more they're able to install more of these sewers and roads and better buildings and infrastructure at all layers of society, the better it gets. And so I don't attribute all this success to Bitcoin, but I do think Bitcoin is that, as I just said, I think it's that essential piece in that feedback loop. And so it's my hope that what we're seeing here, not just here at Bitcoin Beach, but along the entire coast here to a lesser degree of El Salvador, and even all the way in San Salvador and the rest of the country, I hope that that continues here, that hyper accelerates here, that El Salvador becomes a powerhouse and a shining beacon for the rest of Latin America. El Salvador means the savior. Hopefully El Salvador becomes the economic and monetary shining light or savior or whatever of Latin America. That's really exciting to me. I think Latin America has a big advantage over both the West, United States, Canada, Europe, and Africa. Africa has the high upside potential, but frankly, they don't have the capital. Here, they have the capital. They have the ability. They have significantly less wars here than are currently going on in Africa. So I think Latin America has a huge opportunity here economically. I think El Salvador is leading the way, and I think a key component of that, not the essence of it, but a key component of that is Bitcoin. And not because the Bitcoin matters, not because the numbers matter, but because it's about what the numbers can buy you, what the numbers, what you're pricing in terms of the numbers. That's what matters. It's the people that matters. It's economic purchasing power that matters, and it's the human beings that matter. And that is why this is so amazing and exciting to me.